They said the colt wouldn't last long, not with a front leg that bent just a little too far inward, and a gait that looked uncertain each time it tried to lift into a trot. Folks had seen all kinds of colts come through the sales yard over the years, but this one drew a different kind of silence. Not the kind born from awe, but the kind that hangs in the air when people don't want to say something unkind out loud. Buyers walked past with barely a second glance. Some shook their heads. Others muttered things they thought the handlers couldn't hear. Yet everyone agreed on one thing: the bent-leg colt had no value. Still, the little horse stood there, head slightly lowered but eyes bright, trying to understand the world around him. Dust drifted in the warm air, carrying the chatter of traders, the shuffle of boots, and the restless snorts of animals penned nearby. The colt flinched each time a rope snapped against a fence or a gate clanged shut. He was young, too young to understand why people judged him by the way he stepped, or why opinions about his worth were whispered as if he weren't standing right there listening. There was something gentle about him, something that didn't match the harshness of the yard. His coat was the warm shade of wheat, soft and dull from lack of grooming, and his mane hung unevenly as if someone had cut it with a dull blade. His mother had been sold off months earlier, leaving him to fend for himself among handlers who didn't have time to tend to fear or loneliness. The colt had grown used to being pushed around, used to not being chosen. But even then, even while standing alone in that crowded place, there was a quiet resilience in the way he kept lifting that bent leg, trying once more to find balance. A few children stopped to look at him, their voices full of curiosity rather than judgment. One reached out a small hand, but a parent gently pulled the child away, whispering something about not touching horses that weren't worth the trouble. The colt watched them go before lowering his head again. Even though the words weren't meant for him to understand, he sensed the rejection just the same. Animals often know more about people's tones than their languages. Handlers tried to prop up his chances by brushing him down quickly and calling out to shoppers. They spoke of his calm nature, his gentle eyes, the way he followed a person without needing to be pulled. But each time a buyer approached and watched his unsteady steps, they walked off. No one wanted a colt that looked like he would be a burden rather than a partner. The sale yard was a place for strong backs and quick legs, not imperfections that required patience. Still, one man paused longer than the others. He stood at the far end of the pen, leaning slightly on the fence, watching the colt without saying a word. His coat was worn at the seams, and his hat showed years of sun, wind, and work. Something about his posture seemed familiar to the colt, though they had never met. When the man shifted his weight, the colt's ears flicked forward, sensing a presence that felt different from the others. But before anything could come of it, a handler called the man away, needing help with a different sale. The colt remained alone, surrounded by conversations that had nothing to do with him and yet somehow shaped his fate completely. The sale went on with horses being led out one by one, ropes pulled tight, hooves clattering across wooden planks. Every time another animal was sold, the handlers grew more impatient. The colt was still there, unclaimed, unwanted. The whispers grew sharper as the day wore on. People wondered whether he would even sell. Some speculated he'd be pushed into the last lot group, where prices dropped low and hopes dropped even lower. A few shrugged and said that it didn't matter. What could a colt with a bent leg ever grow into anyway? Rain clouds began to gather above the yard, darkening the sky as a cool wind swept through. The colt shivered slightly and huddled close to the fence, unsure whether it was the cold or the growing uncertainty in his chest making him uneasy. The smell of rain mixed with the dusty scent of the sale yard, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. Even the other animals grew restless, pacing and stomping as the air shifted. The handlers finally brought the colt forward, guiding him toward the small ring where potential buyers gathered. A few people glanced over, a few looked away. The colt hesitated at the entrance, unsure of the noise and movement inside. His leg wobbled slightly as he stepped onto the packed dirt, earning murmurs from the crowd. His ears twitched at every sound, but he didn't bolt or rear. He simply stood there, uncertain but willing, hoping this was the moment his fate might shift. The auctioneer tried to start the bidding, calling out his description as confidently as he could. Young colt, calm temperament, easy to handle. He avoided mentioning the leg, but he didn't have to. Everyone saw it. Everyone whispered anyway. One person laughed under their breath, not cruelly but dismissively, as though the colt being presented was hardly worth the effort of attention. The man from earlier returned then, weaving through the small crowd with a slow, deliberate step. His expression didn't give away much, and he didn't immediately approach the ring. Instead, he stood just behind a group of buyers, watching the colt with the same quiet intensity as before. The colt lifted his head slightly, drawn toward the man again without understanding why. The bidding didn't start. No one raised a hand. No one made an offer. The auctioneer cleared his throat and tried again. The silence that followed was heavier this time, settling over the ring like a blanket that no one wanted to lift. Even the wind paused, as though waiting to see what would happen next. The colt shifted his weight, taking a small step that made his leg buckle for a moment. He caught himself, trying to stand tall, trying not to look weak, trying not to let the crowd see how frightened he was. He wanted to belong somewhere. To someone? But the looks in the crowd told him that hope might be too much to ask for. Just then, the rain began to fall in light drops, tapping gently against the wooden roof overhead. Some people drifted away, uninterested in waiting out the weather for a colt they considered worthless. The auctioneer opened his mouth again, ready to make a final call before sending the colt back behind the pens. Once that happened, the outcome would be predictable and not in the colt's favor. The man near the back stepped forward at last. His boots sank slightly into the damp earth, and the light rain darkened the brim of his hat. He didn't lift his hand to bid. He didn't call out an offer. He simply moved toward the ring, every eye turning toward him as he approached. Even the colt sensed something shifting and took a hesitant step in his direction. The handlers froze. The auctioneer paused. The crowded yard grew strangely quiet except for the soft drumming of rain on wood. The colt's breaths came slow and unsure. The man stood at the edge of the ring, staring at the young horse as though seeing something no one else could. And then, right when someone opened their mouth to question what he was doing, the man placed a hand on the fence and took another calm, measured step forward. What happened next would change the colt's story forever, but in that moment everything hung suspended, caught between uncertainty and the faintest spark of hope that hadn't quite taken shape yet. The man didn't rush. He didn't speak. He simply stood there at the edge of the ring, letting the colt look at him without pressure. It was as if he understood that approaching too quickly would only push the young horse further into fear. The handlers exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to call security, step in, or let the moment play out. The auctioneer hesitated, caught between protocol and curiosity. Buyers who had been ready to leave stopped in their tracks. Something in the air had shifted, a quiet tension that pulled every gaze toward the man and the colt like a magnet. The colt lifted his head a little higher, watching the man with wide, damp eyes. The rain had already dampened his wheat-colored coat, leaving dark patches along his back and neck. His ears flicked forward, not in alarm but in recognition of something he couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the calm the man carried? Maybe it was the way he stood, grounded and steady, without a hint of judgment. Or maybe it was the simple fact that no one else had ever looked at him like that before. One of the handlers cleared his throat and pointed toward the bidding area. "If you're here to make an offer, you can step up front," he said, trying to keep things orderly. But the man didn't move toward the bidding platform. Instead, he stepped closer to the fence and rested both hands on the top rail. His shoulders rose and fell slowly, as though he'd taken a deep breath and let it settle into the cool air. The colt shifted again, taking a tentative step closer. His bent leg wobbled slightly, but he steadied himself. His gaze remained fixed on the man, drawn to that steady presence in a way that surprised even the handlers. They had tried everything to get the colt to follow cues that morning. Yet now, without a word spoken, the young horse seemed to be inching forward on his own. The auctioneer finally spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "Sir, are you placing a bid or not?" He wasn't annoyed, only confused. The yard had seen strange moments before, but this one was different. It wasn't chaotic or wild. It was too calm, too focused. Even the rain felt softer around them. The man finally looked up, meeting the auctioneer's stare. "I want him," he said simply. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough certainty to cut through the tension around them. Some buyers raised their brows. Others chuckled softly, thinking the man must be joking. But those closest to him knew he wasn't. Without waiting for judgment or approval, he stepped into the ring. The handler stiffened, ready to intervene, but the man's movements were slow, deliberate, and respectful. The colt took another step, then stopped, trembling slightly from the cold and the uncertainty of what was happening. The man approached until he stood only a few paces away. He knelt down just enough to bring himself to the horse's eye level. Rain dampened the dirt between them, and the sound of boots and hooves outside the ring faded under the weight of the moment. "You've had a rough start," the man murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "But rough starts don't make you worthless." The colt's ears twitched. He lowered his head an inch, drawn by that gentle tone. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the softness behind them. No other person had ever spoken to him like that. The man reached out slowly, palm open and steady, giving the colt time to decide. After a long pause, the colt leaned forward and touched the man's hand with the tip of his nose. A hush swept through the yard. Everyone saw it. Everyone felt it. A moment of connection that shouldn't have been possible for a colt who'd known only fear and rejection. But the man didn't celebrate or rush to claim victory. He kept his posture still, respecting the colt's choice, letting the bond settle naturally. Only after the colt remained calm for several breaths did the man stand again. When he did, he motioned to the auctioneer. "I'll take him," he said. People whispered. Why would a man pay for a colt with a bent leg? What could he possibly want with an animal that others dismissed as hopeless? Buyers shook their heads, muttering about wasted money and wasted time, but the man didn't seem bothered. He reached into his worn coat, pulled out what funds he had, and settled the purchase without asking questions, without trying to haggle, without looking at anyone else in the crowd. The handlers opened the gate, expecting the colt to struggle or refuse to move. But when the man stepped outside and gave a gentle gesture, the young horse followed. His steps were uneven, his leg dragging slightly through the mud, but he didn't hesitate. He followed the man out of the ring, leaving the crowd behind, leaving the whispers behind, leaving the judgment behind. Once they were away from the noise, the man paused beside an old hitching post where a simple rope halter waited. He didn't force it onto the colt. Instead, he held it out and let the young horse sniff it. When the colt didn't pull away, he slipped it gently over his head. The colt flinched at first, expecting roughness, but the man's touch remained steady and patient. A few feet away, a young worker watched with wide eyes. "How'd you do that?" he asked. "He fought every person who tried to handle him this morning." The man didn't take his eyes off the colt. "Sometimes," he said, "you don't start with control. You start with trust." The words lingered in the air, giving the moment an unexpected weight. The worker nodded, though he didn't fully understand. Most people in the yard saw horses as either useful or not. There wasn't much space in between. But this man seemed to see something different, something beyond the bent leg, beyond the fear, beyond the shaky steps. With the purchase settled, the man guided the colt toward a small covered area where the rain dripped steadily from the edges of the roof. He crouched again and ran his hand gently along the colt's shoulder. The horse tensed at first, then relaxed under the warmth of the man's touch. It was the first moment of calm he had felt in a long time. "You're stronger than you know," the man said quietly. "You just need someone willing to see it." As the rain slowed, the man led the colt farther across the yard toward a wagon hitched to a sturdy bay mare. The mare looked over at the colt with mild curiosity but didn't react sharply. The man secured the colt nearby, not tying him too tight, just enough to keep him safe. The colt trembled slightly, not from fear but from uncertainty. He didn't know where he was going or why this man had chosen him. He only knew that the man had offered him something no one else had. A chance. The worker approached again, more curious now. "What are you planning to do with him?" he asked. The man watched the colt for a long moment before answering. "Give him a life that isn't decided by what others think he can't do." The worker blinked, not expecting such a simple yet powerful explanation. "Even with that leg, especially with that leg," the man replied. "That bent leg kept him fighting to stay upright. That means he's been trying his whole life. An animal like that has heart." The worker didn't argue. He looked at the colt again and tried to see what the man saw, but all he could see was the uneven stance, the thin frame, the stubborn angle of the leg. Still, he felt something shift inside him, a small spark of hope that maybe the colt's story wasn't as hopeless as people claimed. As the man prepared the wagon, the colt watched him closely, following each movement with quiet curiosity. He didn't understand the tools or the ropes, but he recognized the care behind every action. The man didn't rush or pull harshly. He didn't mutter frustrated words or treat the colt like a burden. Everything he did felt careful, deliberate, and gentle. Soon, the wagon was ready. The man guided the colt forward once again. The young horse hesitated only slightly before stepping toward the open space. His leg dragged a bit, but he tried. That small effort didn't escape the man's notice. "You've got a brave streak," the man murmured. Just as they were about to leave the sale yard, a voice called out behind them. "You sure about taking that one home?" someone asked. "You'll be wasting your time." The man didn't turn around. He simply placed a steady hand on the colt's neck, giving a quiet reassurance that only the horse needed to hear. Then he guided the colt forward, out of the yard, down the dirt path leading toward a future the colt couldn't imagine yet. But the real struggle, the real heart of the story, was still waiting ahead. The colt's past had been full of hardship, but what came next would challenge both him and the man in ways no one around the sale yard could have predicted. The days that followed carried a quiet strain beneath every word spoken around the ranch. It felt as if everyone sensed the weight of something shifting, yet no one dared to name it. The colt moved with slow steps, learning to trust the rhythm of the place, while the man tried to understand what had driven him to feel protective over an animal the world had dismissed. He kept noticing the way the colt watched him, as if measuring his intention. There was a strange bond forming, something that went deeper than simple ownership, something tied to the idea that maybe broken things were not as worthless as folks claimed. The main conflict began settling itself into every corner of life. The ranch had long struggled to stay afloat. Drought had eaten into the fields, cattle prices had dipped, and the owner who ran the auctions had hinted more than once that debts were piling up. Whispers moved through the nearby town, saying the ranch might be forced to sell land or close its gates. Each whisper stirred more tension. The man had grown up working these pastures, and the idea of losing them felt like losing part of who he was. Still, he rarely spoke about it. He carried the pressure on his shoulders and tried not to let it show. The colt, with its bent leg and uneven gait, became a symbol of everything uncertain. Some of the ranch hands said he was wasting time feeding a creature that would never bring any value. Others said keeping the colt proved he was holding on to hope when the rest of the world had already turned its back. He didn't argue with them. Instead, he worked quietly, showing up each day with feed and patience. As the colt began to trust him, he noticed small changes. The leg still leaned awkwardly, but the animal pushed forward with surprising determination. That single act of trying somehow strengthened the man's own resolve. At the same time, another tangle of conflict rose from an unexpected place. The auction owner had taken notice of the colt, not because of its potential, but because of the talk it stirred. Folks were curious about why anyone would bother with an animal that had been so quickly dismissed. Curiosity was something the auction owner valued, especially when it could draw crowds or earn attention. He approached the man one afternoon with a wide grin and a suggestion that they bring the colt back for another showing. Not to sell, but to use as a story. The man felt unsettled by the idea. He didn't want the colt turned into some spectacle for profit. He wanted to protect it from everything that had already hurt it. Another subplot grew from the arrival of a stranger who began stopping by the ranch. She claimed she had once trained horses and had traveled through many small towns working with animals others had given up on. Her presence created tension even before she spoke a word. Some ranch hands didn't trust outsiders, others welcomed her advice. She seemed interested in the colt, studying its leg carefully and asking questions about its history. The man found himself torn between wanting help and fearing that trusting a stranger might lead to the colt being taken away or used for something he couldn't control. Yet she spoke with a tone that carried quiet understanding, and the colt seemed calm whenever she stood near. Suspense built as the ranch continued to struggle. Supplies thinned, water grew scarcer, tempers rose. Arguments broke out over decisions that would affect the entire place. Whether to sell certain cattle, whether to cut down old trees for resources, whether to give up on animals that needed more care than the ranch could afford. Every choice seemed to carry a consequence that could shift the future. Through all this, the colt became a point of debate. Some said it needed to be let go. Others believed it was a waste of precious time. The man refused to consider either option. He held on to the idea that the colt mattered, even if he didn't fully understand why. One night, an unexpected storm moved across the plains. Heavy winds shook the fences and rain slammed against the ground harder than it had in months. The ranch hands scrambled to gather animals and secure the barns. In the chaos, the colt slipped out of its pen, spooked by the loud crash of an old gate snapping loose. The man ran into the storm, calling out, pushing through sheets of rain to find the frightened creature. Lightning flashed just long enough for him to spot the colt struggling near a fallen beam. He moved quickly, lifting the beam with all his strength and guiding the animal back toward shelter. When they returned soaked and shaking, the ranch hands stared with a mix of worry and disbelief. The storm had caused damage all over the ranch, and emotions ran high as they surveyed what had been lost. The storm only deepened the growing conflicts. Repairs cost money they didn't have. The auction owner returned with new pressure, hinting that selling the colt as part of a dramatic rescue story might draw a crowd and bring in quick cash. The man refused again, feeling anger settle hot in his chest. The stranger watched all of this with a thoughtful expression. She later approached him quietly and said the colt could be taught more than folks expected. Her voice held confidence that didn't sound like empty comfort. She offered to help for nothing in return. This surprised him, and he didn't know whether to trust her or fear what her intentions might be. Still, the idea that the colt could do more filled him with hope he didn't want to lose. Another subplot unfolded with the ranch owner's son, who had been away for years and suddenly returned after hearing about the ranch's troubles. His arrival stirred old feelings and new tension. Some remembered him as reckless. Others remembered him as kind. But he carried a shadow over him, something he didn't talk about, something that made him withdraw when asked. He watched the colt with interest, and the man couldn't tell whether that interest came from admiration or envy. The presence of the ranch owner's son shifted the dynamics between everyone, creating uncertainty that hung over each decision. As the colt slowly grew stronger, the man noticed its determination seemed to inspire people around him too. The stranger spent more time nearby, observing and offering quiet advice. The ranch owner's son started helping more with chores, though he still avoided personal questions. Some ranch hands softened their opinions and stopped complaining about the colt being kept. Even so, the pressure from outside forces continued to build. The ranch's debts weren't disappearing. The auction owner kept pushing for a sale. And rumors spread through town, suggesting buyers were interested in taking over the land entirely. Suspense thickened with each passing day. The man couldn't ignore the feeling that something was coming, something that would force everyone to confront the choices they'd made. He saw how the colt looked stronger when running in the open field, even with its bent leg. He sensed that the animal carried some purpose beyond what anyone had expected. But he also knew that the tension around the ranch was tightening like a rope, pulling everyone closer to a moment where decisions would have to be made. As the sun set one evening, the sky burned with colors that reflected the mix of hope and fear inside him. The colt stood at the fence, ears forward, eyes calm. For a moment the world felt still, but the man knew stillness didn't last. Something waited beyond that silence, something that would push the story toward a turning point. And he felt it approaching fast, leaving him to wonder what would be asked of him and what the colt's place in all of it would be. The days that followed carried a heavy kind of quiet, the sort that made every sound feel sharper than it should have been. The ranch was still recovering from the storm, and though repairs had begun, the weight of everything left undone pressed down on everyone. Fences leaned in awkward angles. Wind-bent boards hung loose on the barn walls. The fields looked tired, as if they were holding their breath alongside the people who worked them. Every sunrise brought more questions, and every sunset left those questions hanging in the air. The colt had grown steadier, though its bent legs still made each step a little uneven. It followed the man with a calm trust that felt deeper than anything he had expected. Sometimes it walked close enough that he could feel its breath on his sleeve. Other times it stood back, watching him as though trying to understand things he didn't dare say out loud. The bond between them had become a quiet anchor in the middle of all the uncertainty. Yet that bond was starting to attract attention he didn't want. More folks were talking about the ranch's troubles. Word had spread through town that a bank meeting was coming soon, one that would decide the ranch's future. Some said the land would be divided. Others believed the owner's family planned to sell the horses and cattle to cover what they owed. Tension climbed each day, and even the animals sensed it. They paced more, reacted faster, and grew restless as if anticipating a shift none of the humans could fully see yet. The auction owner returned with new pressure that stirred more unease. He arrived with bright eyes and a polished smile, the kind he used when he wanted something without saying it outright. He started hinting that the colt's story could be used for a special event, something dramatic that would pull in crowds. He painted a picture of onlookers cheering and buyers bidding high numbers, all while the colt stood in the center of it. The man felt a stubborn refusal rise in him every time the idea was mentioned. He didn't want the colt displayed like some kind of novelty. But each refusal made the auction owner more determined, more insistent, as if the colt had become part of the solution to someone else's problem. The stranger continued visiting the ranch, offering advice and help when she could. She worked with the colt in the mornings, guiding it through simple steps to strengthen its leg and adjust its balance. The man watched her closely, trying to decide whether he could trust her. She spoke gently to the colt, and the animal responded with surprising confidence. She explained that some horses learn to compensate for weaknesses through practice, and that this one had a natural will that shouldn't be overlooked. Her belief stirred something hopeful inside him, something he didn't want to lose. Still, he couldn't ignore the question of why she had chosen this ranch, this colt, and this moment to stay. The ranch owner's son also grew more involved. He took over repairing the far side of the barn and often stayed out late, working until the lanterns burned low. There was something heavy in his expression, something that suggested he carried problems of his own. He rarely spoke about where he had been or why he had returned. But sometimes, when he watched the colt from a distance, the man sensed a mix of admiration and envy in his eyes. That stirred worry. He didn't want anyone else laying claim to the colt, especially now when so many forces seemed to be eyeing it as a solution to their struggles. One evening, the stranger and the ranch owner's son exchanged tense words near the well. The man didn't hear every detail, but he caught enough to understand that their ideas about the ranch's future clashed sharply. She believed the ranch could still be saved with the right adjustments. He believed the ranch needed to face reality and consider selling assets while they still had control. The colt, in his view, was one of those assets. The man felt anger spike inside him when he heard that, but he held himself back, waiting for the right moment. The argument ended with the stranger walking away in silence and the ranch owner's son looking unsettled, almost guilty. That night something strange happened. The man found the colt standing far from its pen, near the ridge where the fields ended. It wasn't running or frightened, just waiting as if listening to something in the distance. The sky was dark, the air heavy, and he sensed a storm brewing inside the ranch even if the weather stayed dry. He guided the colt back, but the moment stayed with him, leaving him uneasy long after the animals had settled. The pressure around the bank meeting grew as the day approached. The ranch owner paced often, rubbing his hands together and muttering about numbers that didn't add up. The ranch hands worked harder, trying to restore order to the land before the bank inspectors arrived, hoping the repairs would show the ranch was still worth investing in. But beneath all that effort, fear ran like a quiet current. Everyone understood the outcome of that meeting could change everything. The man felt torn between helping with the repairs and staying close to the colt, which had become a target in a conflict bigger than either of them. The auction owner's repeated visits made him uneasy. The stranger's presence felt both comforting and mysterious. And the ranch owner's son seemed to be making decisions behind closed doors, talking to people the man didn't recognize. The closer the climax approached, the more tangled the tension became. One afternoon, the stranger asked the man to walk with her toward the far fields. She said she needed to talk about something important. As they walked, the air felt thick with unspoken worry. She told him the colt had more potential than folks realized, not only because of its will, but because of something she had learned long ago. She had worked with horses that had been cast aside, and sometimes those horses ended up doing extraordinary things. She hinted that the colt could be trained for something meaningful, something that might even help the ranch. But before she could explain further, they were interrupted by shouts coming from the barn. When they returned, they found a group of men standing near the corral with the ranch owner's son. These men weren't ranch hands. They wore clean shirts, polished boots, and confident expressions that didn't belong to folks who worked the land. The man recognized the look of businessmen, the type that saw animals and property as numbers rather than lives. The ranch owner's son introduced them as interested buyers who were exploring options for asset transfer in case the bank meeting didn't go well. They eyed the colt with calculating interest, speaking about value and potential profit as if the animal couldn't feel their stares. The man felt anger build inside him in a sharp way he hadn't felt before. The stranger stepped close to the colt, placing her hand on its neck as if shielding it. The tension between everyone tightened until the air felt ready to snap. The ranch owner's son tried to reassure everyone that it was only a conversation, not a decision. But the man could see the truth behind his eyes. Part of him had already decided to let go of whatever the ranch needed to survive, even if it meant giving up the colt. The next days were filled with uneasy glances, whispered conversations, and silent meals. The man stayed near the colt as much as he could, sensing that something was building toward a moment none of them could escape. The auction owner returned again, this time with a small crowd of interested parties following him. The ranch owner's son argued with the stranger near the corral. The ranch owner himself grew pale from stress. And the colt, sensing all the tension, stayed close to the man, its ears shifting nervously at every raised voice. The night before the bank meeting, the ranch fell into an unnatural stillness. Even the animals seemed quiet. The man stayed awake long after the lanterns had burned out, sitting near the colt as it slept. He knew the next day would force everyone to make choices they had been avoiding. He could feel the story tightening around them, pulling them toward something that would define what happened to the ranch, the colt, and everyone tied to this land. And as dawn approached, carrying a dim light across the fields, the sense of coming conflict grew stronger, pressing into every breath as the moment moved closer to breaking open. The morning after the climax felt quieter than it should have, as if the ranch itself needed a moment to breathe again. The storm of arguments, accusations, and decisions had passed, leaving behind a calm that didn't feel empty but instead felt like a path finally clearing. The man stood beside the colt's pen, watching the young horse stretch its bent leg in the early light. Its movements were still uneven, but there was a steady confidence in the way it held its head now. Something had changed, not just for the colt but for everyone who had been pulled into the struggle. The bank meeting had started with tension, so thick it reminded everyone of the bad days before the storm repairs. Faces were tight, voices were clipped, and the ranch owner's hands shook more than usual. The buyers who had shown interest in the colt had been waiting outside with their polished boots and sharp looks, fully expecting to walk away with whatever deal they wanted. But the atmosphere shifted when the stranger stepped forward and asked to speak. Her calm words had surprised everyone. She explained the progress the colt had made, the dedication shown by the man, and the potential the ranch still had if given a fair chance. She spoke not as someone trying to save just one animal, but as someone who believed the ranch could rise again if the right decisions were made. The man had stood beside her, unsure at first whether his voice mattered. But when he talked about the colt, the ranch's history, and the work people had put into restoring the land, something about his sincerity made the room pause. He wasn't asking for pity or special treatment. He was asking for time. A little more time to give the ranch a chance to stand on its own again. The bank representatives listened in a way no one expected. They saw the repaired fences, the organized barns, and the effort put into rebuilding. They understood the weather had caused part of the trouble, not neglect. By the end of the meeting, the ranch owner received an extension instead of a foreclosure notice. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was enough. Enough for everyone to breathe again. Enough to keep the ranch standing. When the buyers heard the news, their interest in the colt faded. They wanted something quick, something profitable, not a story about healing and patience. They left that afternoon, their polished boots kicking dust as they rode away. For the first time in many weeks, the man felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The colt was safe, the ranch was safe, and the people he had grown close to finally had room to think about the future instead of fighting it. The ranch owner approached him later that day with tired but grateful eyes. He admitted he had been scared of losing everything his family had built. He apologized for the pressure he had put on the people around him, especially the man who had taken responsibility for the colt without ever asking for reward. He promised the colt would never be treated as a bargaining chip again. The man nodded, feeling a quiet relief settle inside him. He never wanted the colt to be anything other than what it was, a young horse with a bent leg and a brave heart. The ranch owner's son also sought him out. His apology was awkward, scattered, and heavy with regret. He admitted he had acted out of fear and desperation, convincing himself that selling the colt might solve everything. But when he saw how the colt responded to the man, something inside him had softened. He promised to step back and let the man decide what was best for the colt from now on. They shook hands, not as rivals, but as people who had finally understood one another. As for the stranger, she stayed longer than anyone expected. She continued helping with the colt's training, guiding its leg through slow exercises and encouraging the man to keep believing in small progress. They talked in quiet corners of the ranch, sharing stories about the horses they had known, the places they had traveled, and the moments that had shaped them. She revealed a little more about her past, explaining she had once worked with abused and abandoned animals because she believed every creature deserved a second chance. When she looked at the colt, she saw not weakness but determination. Over time, the colt grew stronger. The bend in its leg never fully straightened, but its stride improved enough that it could move comfortably across the fields. It followed the man everywhere, trusting him more each day. And he, in turn, found himself opening up to the small joys of the ranch again. He woke in the mornings with a sense of purpose. He repaired fences with more care. He fed the animals with a steady hand. And in the evenings, he often stood beside the colt, watching the sun fall behind the hills in a warm glow that always made him think the ranch would be all right. When word spread through town about how the colt had been saved, folks came to see it. They expected a sad little horse with no future. Instead, they found a spirited colt with bright eyes, a playful nature, and a story that softened even the toughest hearts. Some said it reminded them of the days when hope meant more than money. Others said it proved that the value of a life couldn't be measured by a bent leg or a broken past. The colt became a quiet symbol of the ranch's resilience, and people left the ranch with more respect than they had ever shown before. Eventually, the stranger prepared to leave. She stood with the man near the gate, the colt nudging her gently as if asking her to stay. She smiled and told the colt it would be just fine, then turned to the man and thanked him for trusting her. She said she had other places to go, other animals that needed help, but she would remember this ranch. She would remember the man who fought for a horse everyone else had given up on. With a final steady look, she wished him well and walked away, her figure growing smaller until the road swallowed her. Life returned to a peaceful rhythm after that. The ranch owner kept his promise to manage the land with more care. The ranch owner's son took on responsibilities with renewed focus, aware now of how close they had come to losing everything. The man continued training the colt, guiding it across open fields where its confidence grew stronger. He learned to read the colt's moods, to understand when it needed rest and when it was eager to push forward. The bond between them deepened into something steady and permanent. In time, the colt became an important part of the ranch. It couldn't run like the fastest horses, but it could help with herding, with guiding younger animals, and with giving comfort to visitors who came seeking a bit of calm. Children loved brushing its coat, travelers admired its gentle spirit, and older folks said they felt something healing about being near a horse that had overcome so much without losing its trust. The man often thought about how easily things could have turned out differently. How close the ranch had come to falling apart. How one colt with a bent leg had drawn everyone together, forcing them to face their fears, their mistakes, and their hopes. He realized the colt hadn't just been saved. It had saved something in all of them, too. As the seasons changed and the ranch flourished again, the man walked the colt to the ridge where they had stood that uneasy night. The wind carried the same soft whistle through the grass, but this time there was no fear behind it, only peace. The colt leaned against him gently, as if sharing the moment. He looked across the fields, feeling the truth settle inside him. Sometimes the smallest life can carry the biggest meaning. Sometimes the overlooked story becomes the one everyone remembers. And sometimes a bent-leg colt, once said to have no value, can teach an entire community what second chances are truly worth. With that quiet thought warming his chest, he turned back toward the ranch, the colt walking faithfully at his side, ready for the life they had fought so hard to build.